Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelenskyy has signed a new bill into law aimed at boosting troop numbers for the war against Russia. The new law requires potential conscripts to update their data with the authorities. It also increases payments to volunteers and adds new punishments for dodging draft. Let's bring in our correspondent, Charles Stratford. He's joining us live from Kostiantynivka in eastern Ukraine. And this move coming, Charles, as Ukraine struggles to free up more manpower for its military Russian invasion continuing into a third year. Tell us about the conscription bill that President Zelenskyy has signed.
That's right. This bill is critically important in order to sort of supply the legal framework that's needed for a lot of conscription that the Ukrainian government, the Ukrainian military say is needed for a mobilization as soon as possible. Western intelligence agencies, the Ukrainian military, are saying that they expect Russian forces to mount what's being described as a concerted push, potentially in the next few weeks, certainly early summer. That's the sort of time frame that's being bandied around. So as you can imagine, this is very important when we've already been told, we already know that Ukraine is suffering a severe manpower shortage on the front lines. I'll just run you through some of the provisions of this law that was signed by Zelenskyy today. It's also worth bearing in mind that this has been highly controversial. The first version was just thrown out in January. There was a second draft that was put forward that passed its first reading, but there were 4,000 amendments made before the second reading, and that's what's been signed by Zelenskyy today. It includes the introduction of mandatory medical checks for those people who were previously held to have only partial eligible status. It heavily penalises those trying to dodge drafts, trying to dodge conscription. There'll be no forced mobilisation for women, 18 to 25-year-olds, no conscription, but basic military training. And I think it's really worth emphasising a provision was taken out of this second reading and has not been signed into law, and that was a provision looking at demobilisation, a provision that previously gave soldiers the right to leave, to be demobilised after serving for 36 months. That has been taken out and is going to be debated separately by Parliament. So you can imagine there are quite a lot of people very angry about this. There's many people that you speak to, soldiers at least as well, and their families, who say that they've done their bit, they need a rest. And again, this sort of highlights the kind of pressures that the Ukrainian army are facing along the front lines.
Yeah, absolutely, Charles. And what's the significance of where you are today?
Well, we're in Kostiantynivka. The road behind me is the main road that leads to the small town of Jazeera. Jazeera, which we've been reporting on now for a few weeks, is a small town just west of Bakhmut that has seen some of the heaviest fighting in recent weeks. We understand that Russian forces are on the outskirts of that town, and there are heavy ongoing battles there. The traffic that you can see behind me going up and down is mainly military, but there are civilians living in some areas in between here and Jazeera. We were close to Jazeera earlier today. We visited one of the first stops for those that are injured, where they are basically being stabilised in that area. And not to put too fine a point on it, the drive to that area was absolutely terrifying for the soldiers and us in the vehicle too. And that's because of the increasing use of drones. This has basically become a drone war. Both sides are using these so-called first-person vision or first-person view drones. These are weaponized kamikaze drones holding explosive devices that track and very accurately hit vehicles and troops. So getting to Jazeera is a huge challenge in terms of supply lines and getting the injured out. The big concern is that if Jazeera falls, and the Kremlin wants to see Jazeera taken control of by Russian forces by the 9th of May, then that heavily exposes this larger city of Kostiantynivka, where we are today. And already we've seen an increase of shelling to the town of Kostiantynivka in recent weeks. Now, in the last few days or so, we've been visiting various towns close to the front line, some of which were initially occupied by Russian forces at the beginning of the war, were then recaptured by the Ukrainian army in that successful initial counter-offensive we saw in the autumn of 2022. And these towns now are being targeted again, and there is great fear, concern amongst the Ukrainian military and the civilians living in these towns that we could see, as I say, Russian forces pushing forward in the next few weeks or so, which makes these towns at great risk indeed. And this is our report.
People still live here, around 2,000 of them struggling to exist among the destruction. Russian forces captured the town of Lyman in May 2022. The Ukrainian army then recaptured the important railway hub with a pre-war population of more than 20,000 around 5 months later. Russian missile and so-called glide bomb attacks have increased in recent weeks, targeting Ukrainian positions in the surrounding forests, taking advantage of what Ukraine says is its potentially catastrophic lack of weaponry and air defense. With tens of billions of dollars worth of military aid either stuck by arguments in the US Congress or not getting here fast enough from European allies, Western intelligence and the Ukrainian military say Russia is now gaining momentum on the battlefield.
Shelling by Russian forces of Lyman and the surrounding countryside is causing fires like this in the forests virtually every day. The people still living inside Lyman are afraid that Russian forces could push through nearby Ukrainian defensive lines.
There's no running water or gas in town. Natalia fled to Dnipro before Russian forces occupied the place she has lived all her life. She returned when the Ukrainian army took back control. Her daughter and granddaughter went to Poland and they don't want to come back. She leads us into her basement. She's had to start sheltering underground again.
Of course I'm very anxious. God willing, it won't happen. We don't need them here. They should go back where they came from. Give us back the life we had. Before, it was a beautiful life and we never asked anything from anyone. We had work, we had a railway, we had a town. Look what they have done to us in our life. No one lives here now. Most people left, and this is our land.
Few people come to the tiny Sunday market. Police check people's IDs hunting for suspected Russian informers. Alexander lived here throughout the Russian army's occupation. I don't want to talk about it, he says. I hid here in the shelter for 2 hours during yesterday's attacks. Vitaly is head of Lyman's fire department. He says his men are now more than ever vulnerable to attack as they try to save lives.
Sadly, the shelling has recently increased. The enemy have hit civilian infrastructure, residential areas, destroying residential buildings, health facilities, and so civilians suffer. The shelling's caused many fires. We receive up to 10 call-outs in a given 24-hour period.
There are many towns near the front line like this one, back in the crosshairs of the Russian army, which Ukraine and its allies say is preparing for a major advance. Stratford, Al Jazeera, Lyman.
Make sure to subscribe to our channel to get the latest news from Al Jazeera.